I came home early and found a stranger sitting in my chair like he owned the place. My wife didn't even flinch. That smirk on his face was the last mistake he ever made in my house, and he had no idea what kind of man he just walked into. My name is Wade Reeves. I'm 46 years old, and I own a commercial cleaning company out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Built it from nothing. One truck, 2 employees, a stack of business cards I handed out at every office park and hotel in the county. 16 years later, Reeves Commercial Services runs 43 contracts across 3 counties and employs 31 people. I'm not a wealthy man by Wall Street standards, but I built something real with my hands, my name, and my word. They used to mean something to me. Still does. I met Carla at a 4th of July cookout at my buddy Rick's place. She was laughing at something across the yard, hair pulled back, wearing a red sundress. And I thought, that's the kind of woman a man builds a life around. We dated 8 months, got engaged at Christmas, married the following October. Cody came along 2 years later. For a long time, things were good. Not perfect, nothing real ever is, but solid. The kind of solid you stop noticing because it's just always there, like the foundation under your feet. I came home early on a Wednesday in March because one of my crew chiefs called in sick, and I'd handle the Hargrove Tower contract myself. Finished 2 hours ahead of schedule. Figure I'd shower at home, maybe take Carla to dinner. I pulled into the driveway and noticed an unfamiliar car parked along the curb. A silver Audi, new model, dealer plates. I didn't think much of it. Figured Carla had a friend over. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside and heard voices from the living room. 2 of them. One was Carla's. The other was a man's, low, relaxed, like he was somewhere he'd been 100 times before. I turned the corner. Carla was on the couch, legs tucked under her, holding a glass of wine. Across from her, settled into my armchair like he'd bought it himself, sat a man I'd never seen in my life. Mid-40s, expensive haircut, open collar shirt, the kind of shoes that cost more than my first truck payment. He didn't flinch when I walked in, didn't stand up, didn't even shift in his seat. He just looked at me. Carla set her glass down slowly. Wade, you're home early. Not, who is this man in our house? Not, let me explain. Just that. Like my arriving in my own home was the inconvenience. I looked at him. Who are you? He tilted his head slightly, like the question amused him. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, not an embarrassed smile. The kind of smile a man gives when he thinks he's already won something. Grant, he said. Grant Hollister. The name meant nothing to me then. Later I'd learn everything about Grant Hollister. That he was the director of operations for a regional hotel chain. That he wore his authority like cologne. That he had a wife named Cheryl at home who had no idea where he spent his Wednesday afternoons. But in that moment, all I knew was that he was sitting in my chair, in my house, looking at me like I was something that had wandered in off the street. You need to stand up, I said. He raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. You're in my house. My chair. You need to stand up. Carla moved to get between us. Wait, don't. Carla. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. I'm talking to him. Grant set his glass down on the end table, my end table, and rose slowly, deliberately, like a man performing patience for an audience. He was a few inches shorter than me, but carried himself like height was irrelevant. He looked me over the way a contractor looks at a structure he's already decided to tear down. Look, he began, his tone smooth and reasonable. I think. Don't. I took one step toward him. Don't manage me. Don't explain. Don't tell me what you think. You walked into my home and sat down in my chair. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you are. Something shifted in his expression then. Just a flicker. The easy confidence bent slightly at the edges. Not gone, but bent. Good. I wanted him to feel the ground move under him, even just for a second. I turned to Carla. Her face was unreadable. Not guilty, not scared. Somewhere between annoyed and calculating. That expression told me more than anything she could have said. This wasn't a mistake she was scrambling to explain. This was a situation she was managing. Get him out of this house, I said quietly. She opened her mouth. Now, Carla. Grant gathered his jacket from the back of my chair. The small detail of that burned something deep, and walked to the door without another word. Carla followed him into the hallway. I heard low voices, brief, and then the front door opened and closed. She came back into the living room alone. I was standing at the window, watching his silver Audi pull away from the curb. My hands were steady. My chest was not. It's not what you're thinking, she said. I didn't turn around. You should know me well enough by now to know I'm not going to respond to that. Silence. Then her footsteps going upstairs. I stood there for a long time after that, watching the empty street, turning things over in my mind. The way she'd said you're home early, not surprised, just recalibrating. The way he'd looked at me, like I was a problem with an obvious solution. Like walking into my house had been nothing. Like he'd already decided I was nothing. He should have kept walking the day he first stepped through my door. Before that night was over, he was going to start understanding why. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was falling apart. I wasn't. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold somewhere around midnight. And I thought, methodically, the way I think through a contract problem or a staffing issue. Emotion is useful for about 10 minutes. After that, it just gets in the way. Carla had gone to bed without another word. I heard the bedroom door close, heard the lock click. She actually locked it, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was clarity, the kind that only comes when the last comfortable illusion burns away. By morning I had a list. First call I made was to my older brother Dennis. He's 53, retired from the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Department after 22 years. Now he does consulting work for insurance companies, fraud investigation, asset recovery. Dennis has seen the worst of people for most of his adult life, and it made him the sharpest, most unsentimental man I know. When I told him what happened, he didn't say he was sorry. He said, "Don't touch anything in the house. Don't move money. Don't say another word to her until I get there." He was at my door by noon. We sat at the kitchen table while Carla was out. I didn't know where, didn't ask, and I laid out everything I knew. Dennis listened without interrupting, which is his way. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "Grant Hollister, hotel operations. That's not a man who wanders into situations by accident. That's a man who plans." He was already pulling out his phone. While Dennis started making calls, I went through my own records. Carla and I had separate checking accounts and one joint account for household expenses. I went back through the joint account statements for the past year, something I'd never had reason to do before. What I found made my jaw tighten. Restaurants I'd never been to. A hotel charge in Raleigh on a weekend. I'd been at a trade conference. A spa day that cost $400 on a Tuesday afternoon. Small things, individually. Together, they painted a picture. Dennis came back inside around 2 o'clock. He sat down, set his phone on the table, and gave me the look he used to give me when we were kids and I was about to hear something I didn't want to hear. "Hollister has a right-hand man," he said. "Curtis Payne. Works under him as operations coordinator for the hotel group. Your brother-in-law's buddy at the county recorder's office ran the name. Payne's been booking hotel rooms under his own name 2 or 3 times a month for the past 8 months. Same properties in the hotel group's portfolio. Nice rooms. Not business rate." I stared at him. He was covering for Hollister. Running interference, Dennis confirmed. Payne knew. He's been in it from the start. That changed the math considerably. This wasn't a man who lost his head over a woman. This was an operation. Hollister had resources, a willing accomplice, and apparently, a wife at home named Cheryl who had no idea any of it was happening. "One more thing," Dennis said. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "Dad's deed transfer from 2004. The house is titled solely in your name. Always has been." I remembered that. Dad had insisted on it before the wedding. Not because he disliked Carla, but because he'd watched his own brother lose everything in a divorce, and he wasn't having that happen to his son. I'd signed the paperwork, filed it, and never thought about it again. Carla had never brought it up either. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe she assumed. "She's going to claim equitable interest," Dennis said. "Her lawyer will argue she contributed to the household. Let them argue." I folded the deed and put it in my jacket pocket. They can argue all the way to the courthouse steps. Dennis studied me for a moment. "You doing okay?" I thought about the question honestly. "Ask me again in a month." He nodded. That was enough for him, and enough for me. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway. Carla's Honda. I watched through the window as she sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Head down, probably on her phone, probably talking to him. I picked up my coffee mug, rinsed it at the sink, and set it in the drying rack. Then I turned and waited for the door to open. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. I'd stopped being her husband somewhere around midnight. Now I was something else entirely. Something patient, and prepared, and not going anywhere. Carla tried to talk to me the next morning. I was at the kitchen counter going through emails when she came downstairs, poured herself coffee, and stood on the other side of the island like we were about to negotiate a contract. "We need to discuss this like adults," she said. I looked up from my laptop. "I'm being an adult. I'm just not being a convenient one." She set her mug down. "Wade, whatever you think is happening, I'm going to stop you there." I closed the laptop. Because every sentence that starts that way ends with you telling me what I saw wasn't what I saw. And I'm not interested in that conversation. Her jaw tightened. "So what are you interested in?" "Truth. Paperwork. Clarity." I picked up the laptop and walked to my office. In that order. Dennis came back that afternoon with a folder. He spread across my desk without ceremony. That's his style. No preamble, just facts. He'd pulled phone records through a contact at the carrier, cross-referenced with hotel check-in logs his insurance contact had access to. What I was looking at was 14 months of documented meetings. Raleigh, Greensboro, twice in Asheville, one time in a hotel 12 minutes from our house. 12 minutes. I sat with that for a moment. Then I moved on, because sitting with things too long doesn't serve anybody. "Curtis Payne booked every one of these rooms," Dennis said, tapping the page. His corporate card, his name on the reservation. Hollister's name doesn't appear anywhere in the paper trail. That's not accidental. That's a system. "How long has Payne known?" "From the beginning, best I can tell. He's not a passive participant, Wade. He's infrastructure." I leaned back in my chair. I thought about what kind of man builds that kind of infrastructure for another man's affair. The loyalty it implied. The moral flexibility. Then I thought about what happened when that infrastructure became public record. "What about Hollister's wife?" I asked. Dennis shook his head. "Cheryl Hollister, 47, runs a nonprofit arts organization in Concord. By all appearances, completely in the dark." He paused. "That's your call, not mine." I nodded slowly. It was my call. I'd think about it. The next morning, I called my accountant and had him pull every joint financial record for the past 2 years. What I found aligned with what I'd already suspected. Carla had been spending on things that had nothing to do with our household. The total came to just over $9,000 across 18 months. Not a fortune, but it was money spent in service of a lie, and that mattered. Then Dennis called with something that shifted the whole picture. "Hollister's been running personal expenses through his company account," he said. "Hotels, dinners, 2 weekend trips. I've got the billing records. His company reimburses him for what he codes as client entertainment." I was quiet for a moment. That's not just cheating. That's fraud. Corporate fraud, potentially. Depends on how his board views unauthorized use of company funds. Dennis let that land. "I know someone at the Regional Business Journal. Good reporter. Thorough." I thought about Bridget Harper. I met her once at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. Sharp woman. Asked good questions. "I know who to call," I said. I didn't call her yet. Not that day. First I had another conversation to have. Carla informed me that evening. Not asked, informed, that she'd retained an attorney. Monica Sloan. I knew the name. Every man in Charlotte who'd been through a difficult divorce knew the name. "She'll be reaching out to you this week," Carla said, standing in the doorway of my office like she was delivering a memo. "That's fine," I said, without looking up from what I was reading. "She's very experienced." "I'm sure she is." Carla hesitated, clearly expecting more reaction than she was getting. "Wade, this doesn't have to be a war." I looked up then, studied her face for a moment. The careful neutrality she was wearing, the slight tension around her eyes. "You brought a man into our home, Carla. You sat on our couch with him like I didn't exist." I held her gaze. "It was already a war. You just forgot to tell me we were fighting." She left without answering. I went back to the folder on my desk. Monica Sloan was experienced, no question. But experience only helps when the other side isn't prepared. And I was more prepared than anyone in this situation yet understood. Bridget Harper answered on the second ring. I thought carefully about the call before I made it. I'm not a man who acts on impulse. Never have been. Every contract I've signed, every employee I've hired, every piece of equipment I bought has gone through a deliberate process. This was no different. I weighed what I'd gain against what I'd expose, and I decided the math worked in my favor. "Mr. Reeves," she said, and I could hear the interest click into place immediately. Reporters have a specific tone when a story walks up and introduces itself. "I was wondering if you'd call. You knew I might. I heard some things. I was deciding whether to reach out." A pause. So you want to talk? Off the record first, I said. Then we'll see. We met at a diner near my office the following morning. Bridget was exactly as I remembered. Mid-30s, direct eye contact. A notebook she held like it was part of her hand. I laid out what I had. Not everything, not the personal details of my marriage, but the business angle. A senior operations executive at a regional hotel chain running personal expenses through corporate accounts. A subordinate being used as a financial cover. The paper trail Dennis had assembled was thorough. Bridget listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her pen down and said, "This is verifiable. Every page. And your motivation for bringing this to me?" I looked at her steadily. He walked into my house and sat down in my chair. "I want the people who write his performance reviews to know what kind of man he is." She held my gaze for a moment, then picked up her pen again. "Give me a week." I gave her the documents and walked out into the October morning, feeling something I hadn't felt in days: momentum. That same afternoon, Dennis called with another piece. He'd gone deeper on Curtis Payne and found something worth noting. Payne had used his corporate card not just for hotel rooms, but for restaurant charges and one significant weekend booking at a resort in the mountains, all coded under vague line items. The total exposure across the paper trail exceeded $22,000. "Payne's not just a helper," Dennis said. "He's liable." "Send it all to Bridget," I said. While that fuse was burning, I turned my attention to the legal front. Monica Sloan's office had sent over an initial letter outlining Carla's position. She was claiming half the value of the business, spousal support, and what the letter carefully called an equitable share of the marital residence. I read it twice, then called my own attorney, a man named Paul Garrett who'd handled my business contracts for 9 years. I walked him through everything. "The house," he said immediately. "Show me the deed." I sent him a copy. He called back in 20 minutes. "She has no claim on the house," Paul said. "It's titled solely in your name, predating the marriage. Her attorney knows this, or she's about to find out. The business is more complicated, but you've kept clean books and I've seen them. We're in a strong position." "What about the joint account spending?" I asked. "Document it all. Every dollar she spent on this situation is relevant to equitable distribution arguments." He paused. "Wade, who's her attorney again?" "Monica Sloan." A brief silence. "She's good, but she's not miracle worker good. I'll have a response letter out by end of week." I hung up and sat back. Two fronts moving simultaneously, the legal defense tightening, the public exposure accelerating. Grant Hollister had walked into my home with everything going his way. A good job, a cover story, a man running interference, a wife who trusted him. By the time Bridget Harper's article hit, most of that would be gone. By the time my attorney finished with Monica Sloan's demands, the rest would follow. I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger is loud and inefficient. What I felt was focused. There's a difference, and the difference matters. Bridget Harper called me on a Thursday morning, 8 days after our diner meeting. "It's ready," she said. "Running online tonight, print edition tomorrow. I wanted you to know before it went live." I was sitting in my truck outside a client building on Tryon Street. Coffee going cold in the cup holder. "How thorough?" "Very." A pause. I independently verified the expense records through 2 sources inside the hotel group. Curtis Payne confirmed some of it without meaning to. He thought I was calling about a routine industry piece. Grant Hollister declined to comment, which, in my experience, speaks for itself. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat there for a moment, watching people move along the sidewalk below, going about their ordinary Thursday. By tomorrow morning, Grant Hollister's ordinary Thursday was going to look very different. I drove back to the office, worked through the afternoon, and said nothing to anyone. Dennis called around to tell me he'd already heard whispers through his insurance contacts that something was moving inside the hotel group's corporate structure. Quiet conversations at the board level, the kind that happened before formal action. I told him about Bridget's article. He said, "Good timing." The article went live at 7 that evening. I read it at my kitchen table while Carla was upstairs. Bridget had done exactly what she'd promised. Thorough, factual, precise. She traced the expense pattern across 14 months, named Payne as the operational cover, and outlined the total financial exposure in clear language. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't need to. The facts were enough. By 9 o'clock, Carla came downstairs. She'd clearly seen it. Her face had a tightness to it I hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly. More like someone recalculating. Did you do that? She asked, standing in the kitchen doorway. I looked up from my laptop. Do what? The article. Grant called me. Her voice had an edge I recognized. The tone she used when she wanted to sound calm, but wasn't. His board is pulling his contract. Wait, I gave a reporter factual information about corporate fraud. I said. Grant Hollister did the rest himself. That's not. She stopped. Pressed her lips together. You're trying to destroy him. I'm trying to be accurate. I closed the laptop. He used company money to fund something that wasn't company business. That's not my opinion, Carla. That's what the records show. She stared at me for a long moment. Then, quietly, this is going to affect me too. That's something you should have considered 14 months ago. She left the room without another word. I heard her go upstairs, heard the bedroom door close. I stayed at the table and pulled up the article again, reading it through a second time. Below it, comments were already accumulating. Local business community people, some outraged, some unsurprised. One comment near the top, from a username I didn't recognize. Finally, everyone in this industry knew something was off with that operation. My phone buzzed. A text from Dennis. Board voted tonight. Hollister's out. Payne placed on administrative leave, pending review. I set the phone face down on the table. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A dog barking somewhere down the block. A car passing slowly. Everything ordinary. Everything changed. Monica Sloan was exactly what her reputation promised. Composed, precise, and relentless. She sat across from me and Paul Garrett in a conference room downtown, a leather portfolio open in front of her, and laid out Carla's position like she was presenting a business proposal. Half the company. Spousal support for 7 years. An equitable share of the marital home. Paul let her finish. Then he opened his own folder. The marital home, he said, sliding a document across the table, is titled solely in my client's name, predating the marriage by deed transfer. There is no joint ownership, no co-signed mortgage, no legal basis for an equitable claim under North Carolina property law. He paused, letting her read. You know this, Miss Sloan. I imagine you discovered it before we sat down today. Sloan's expression didn't shift. She was too professional for that. But something behind her eyes recalibrated. Equitable distribution arguments don't require joint title, she said smoothly. They require contribution, Paul replied. We have documentation showing Mrs. Reeves has not been employed for the past 9 years. We also have joint account records showing approximately $9,200 spent on what we will characterize as personal expenditures unrelated to the household, during a period when the marriage was, by Mrs. Reeves' own conduct, not functioning as a genuine partnership. Sloan glanced at Carla, who was seated beside her, perfectly still. As for the business, Paul continued. Reeves Commercial Services was founded 4 years before the marriage, capitalized entirely by my client's personal funds and labor. Mrs. Reeves has had no operational role, no financial contribution, and no legal stake. He folded his hands on the table. We're prepared to discuss reasonable spousal support for a defined transition period. We are not prepared to discuss business ownership or property division on the terms you've outlined. Sloan made a note. My client made significant personal sacrifices in support of this marriage. I spoke for the first time. So did I. I kept my voice level, looking directly at Carla rather than her attorney. I worked 60-hour weeks to build something stable. I covered every household expense, every vacation, every car payment. And while I was doing that, you were spending that stability on someone else. I let that sit for a moment. I'm not angry about it anymore, Carla. But I'm also not going to pretend it didn't happen when we're talking about what's fair. Carla looked at the table. Sloan straightened her portfolio. We'll need time to review the documentation. Take all the time you need, Paul said pleasantly. Walking out of that building into the October afternoon, Paul fell in a step beside me and said quietly, she wasn't expecting the property deed. That was the anchor of their whole position. I know, I said. They'll come back with a modified offer. Spousal support, maybe a lump sum. No business, no house. Tell them I'll consider reasonable support for 2 years, I said. Nothing else. Paul nodded. We shook hands at the parking garage and went our separate ways. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before starting the engine. Thought about that conference room. Thought about Carla sitting beside her attorney, carefully not looking at me. Thought about the fact that 8 months ago, we'd sat across from each other at our own kitchen table and talked about taking a trip to the coast that summer. I started the engine and pulled out into traffic. Some things you grieve and move forward. That's not weakness. That's just what living looks like. Lloyd Vaughn has lived next door to me for 11 years. He's 67, retired from a textile plant he'd worked since he was 19, and he has the particular wisdom that comes from a man who's made most of his mistakes early and spent the decade since thinking carefully about what they cost him. He was divorced twice, once in his 30s, once in his mid-40s, and he never talked about either marriage unless you asked directly. When you did ask, he answered without self-pity and without bitterness, which told you everything you needed to know about how he'd processed it. He knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks into everything, holding a thermos and 2 mugs like a man who'd planned the conversation in advance. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I've slept fine," I said. He handed me a mug anyway, and tilted his head toward the porch. We sat in the 2 wooden chairs I kept out there and looked at the street in the early November light. Leaves down, sky pale, the neighborhood quiet in the way it only gets on weekend mornings. "Dennis told me some of it," Lloyd said. "Hope that's all right." "It's all right." He poured coffee, handed me the mug, and said nothing for a while. That's something I've always respected about Lloyd. He doesn't fill silence just to fill it. After a few minutes, he said, "You know what I wish someone had told me the first time?" I looked at him. "Walk away clean," he said. "Don't chase it down. Don't make them pay. Just take what's yours and walk." He wrapped both hands around his mug. I didn't do that the first time. Spent 2 years making sure Janet felt every bit of what she'd done. And at the end of those 2 years, I'd lost most of my savings, half my friends, and about a decade off my life expectancy. He paused. Janet moved on inside of 8 months. I was still fighting. I considered that. And the second time, I asked. "Second time I walked too clean," he said with a dry half-smile. Turned out Renee needed someone to hold the line for once. I'd learned the wrong lesson. He looked out the street. "There's no perfect answer, son. Just the one you can live with." Dennis came out through the front door with his own coffee and settled onto the porch railing. And for a moment, the 3 of us were just quiet together in the November morning. Then Dennis said, "I think you're past the point of walking away clean, Lloyd. The machine's already running." "That's what I figured," Lloyd said. He looked at me. "Then run it right. Don't do it out of anger. Do it because it's correct." That distinction, anger versus correctness, sat with me the rest of the day. Because Lloyd was right. The anger had burned off in the first 48 hours, and what was left underneath wasn't revenge. It was something more structural. Grant Hollister had sat in my house like he had rights there. He'd used company money to make it possible. Curtis Payne had covered his tracks with deliberate coordination. Those weren't personal grievances. Those were facts that had real-world consequences, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. I wasn't pursuing this because I was bitter. I was pursuing it because it was correct. That's a different thing entirely. Later that evening, Carla found me in the kitchen and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed. She'd been spending more time in the bedroom, emerging occasionally with the careful posture of a woman managing a situation she hadn't fully anticipated. "Monica says the property deed is going to hold," she said. "She's recommending we focus on support and business valuation." "Paul's already responded to that," I said, not looking up from the paperwork on the table. "Wade." She waited until I looked at her. "I know I hurt you. I do know that. But we're going to be talking to lawyers and signing things for the next several months. And I'd rather do it without the 2 of us treating each other like enemies in our own home." I studied her for a moment. There was something genuine in it. Not remorse exactly, but a kind of exhausted pragmatism that I could respect, even if I couldn't meet it with warmth. "I don't treat you like an enemy, Carla," I said. "I treat you like someone who made a choice and is living with the consequences. That's not hostility. That's just accurate." She looked at the table. "Grant lost his position today. Officially, I heard. He called me." Her voice was careful. "He blames me as much as you, apparently." I didn't say anything to that. I'd expected it. Men like Grant Hollister don't absorb accountability gracefully. When things fall apart, they look for someone else to assign it to. Carla had made herself available for that assignment the moment she let him into our home. "That's the thing about men who operate the way he operated," I said finally. "They're fine when everything goes their way. The moment it doesn't, they need someone to blame." I looked at her directly. You should have known that about him before now. She didn't answer. She pushed off the counter and went back upstairs. I stayed at the table until nearly midnight, going through the final financial documents Paul would need for the support negotiation. Outside, the neighborhood had gone fully dark and quiet. I thought about what Lloyd had said. Do it because it's correct. I thought about what the next few months would look like, the paperwork and the meetings and the gradual dismantling of 16 years. I thought about Cody, who'd been quiet lately, watching both of us from a careful distance the way teenagers do when they sense structural instability in the adults around them. I need to talk to him soon. He deserved a straight conversation, not the muted tension of a house waiting to change shape. I put the papers away, washed my mug, and went to bed. Tomorrow was a work day. 31 people depended on me to show up functional, and I wasn't going to let any of this make me someone who let that slide. I found Cody in the garage on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on the workbench with his headphones around his neck and his phone face down beside him. He was 16, but he had moments that made him seem older, a particular stillness he'd inherited from somewhere I couldn't quite identify. I pulled up a stool and sat across from him. You've been quiet, I said. He shrugged. So have you. Fair point. You know something's going on, I said. It wasn't a question. He looked at me then. Yeah, Dad. I'm not 12. I nodded. I decided beforehand to give him the truth in plain language without loading it with my own weight. He was old enough to handle it, and too old to be protected from it. Your mom and I are separating. It's not a decision I made. It's the result of something that happened that I'm not going to put on your shoulders. But I'm not going to lie to you about the direction things are heading. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor of the garage, the oil stains, the outline of where the riding mower used to sit before I sold it 2 years ago. Is it because of that guy? He asked. I looked at him. You saw him. I came home early from Tyler's that Wednesday. I saw the car out front, looked through the window. He said it matter-of-factly, like he'd been carrying it for weeks and had run out of energy to carry it carefully. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. Something moved through my chest that I didn't have a clean name for. My 16-year-old son had been sitting with that knowledge, alone, for weeks. That was its own kind of failure. Not his, but the general failure of a situation that had put him in a position where he felt he had no one to tell. You could have told me, I said. What would you have done? He asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. Probably the same things I'm doing now, I admitted. But I would have known sooner, and you wouldn't have been carrying it alone. He thought about that. Then, are you going to be okay? I looked at my son, this boy I'd coached through Little League and driven to 1,000 early morning swim practices and watched grow into someone I genuinely respected, and I told him the truth. Yeah, I said. It's going to be a rough stretch, but I've handled rough stretches before. I leaned forward, elbows on knees. What I need you to know is that none of this changes anything between you and me. Your life stays stable. Your mom and I are going to handle this like adults, and you're not going to get caught in the middle of it. He was quiet again. Then, she's still my mom. I know that, I said, and that doesn't change either. Whatever happened between her and me doesn't touch what she is to you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He nodded slowly. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, not gone, but redistributed into something more manageable. He picked up his phone, turned it over in his hands. Dad, he said, not looking up. That guy, was he really that bad? I consider the question. He sat in my house like he owned it, I said. Looked at me like I was already irrelevant. So yeah, he was that kind of guy. Cody was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, good thing he was wrong. I looked at my son and felt something settle in my chest. Something solid and clean that had nothing to do with attorneys or financial records or any of the machinery grinding through my life at that moment. Just this. Just him. Yeah, I said. Good thing. We sat in the garage for another hour after that. Not talking much, just existing in the same space the way fathers and sons sometimes need to. When we went inside, I made dinner. Nothing fancy, just burgers on the stovetop. And we ate at the kitchen table like it was an ordinary Sunday. It almost felt like one. My father called on a Tuesday evening in November. Arthur Reeves was 74 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life working a machine shop in Gastonia, raising 3 boys on a single income and a set of principles that didn't bend to convenience. He wasn't a soft man. He wasn't cruel either. He was precise, the way men who work with their hands tend to be. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. He heard what was happening through Dennis. He hadn't called until now, which told me he'd been thinking about what to say rather than reaching for the phone the moment he had the information. That was his way. Dennis tells me she had an attorney before she had a conversation with you, he said, by way of opening. That's right, I said. A pause. That tells you everything you need to know about how she viewed the marriage. It told me a lot, I agreed. Another pause, longer this time. Then, I put that house in your name for a reason, son. Not because I thought Carla was a bad person. Because I knew that if things ever went wrong, you needed to be standing on something solid. He exhaled slowly. Turns out I was right. You were right, I said. Your grandfather used to say that a man who builds on borrowed ground is always one argument away from losing everything. He was quiet for a moment. You build on your own ground, Wade. Hold it. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't consolation. It was instruction, the kind my father had been delivering my whole life in the fewest possible words. I understood him, which was why I didn't try to extend the conversation into something warmer than it was. Some men show love through precision. Arthur Reeves was that kind of man, and I'd grown up understanding that his directness was its own form of loyalty. I'm all right, Dad, I said. I know you are, he said. That's why I didn't call sooner. We hung up. I sat in the office for a while after that, the room quiet around me, thinking about what he'd said. You build on your own ground. I'd done that. Not just with the house, but with the business, with the life I'd constructed through 20 years of early mornings and calculated decisions. Carla's choices hadn't reached all of it. The parts that mattered had held. The next morning, Cody came into the kitchen before school and poured himself cereal and sat at the counter without the specific, purposeful silence he'd been carrying for weeks. Something had eased in him since our garage conversation. Not resolved. A 16-year-old whose parents are separating doesn't resolve things quickly, but eased. He was processing it like a person instead of carrying it alone, which was all I'd wanted for him. You working late tonight? He asked. Should be home by 6, I said. You want to do something? He shrugged with the specific studied casualness of teenage boys. Maybe watch something. Works for me. He finished his cereal, grabbed his bag, and headed for the door. At the threshold, he paused without turning around. Hey, Dad. Yeah. You know that article about that Hollister guy? It was on Tyler's dad's phone at practice. All the coaches were talking about it. I waited. Tyler's dad said the guy got exactly what he deserved. A pause. I didn't say anything, but I kind of agreed. The door closed behind him. I stood in the kitchen with my coffee and let that sit. My son, 16 years old, carrying more than he should have had to carry, had found his own quiet way to tell me he understood what had happened and where he stood. That meant more than any legal outcome, any financial resolution, any piece of paper Paul Garrett put in front of me. That evening, Paul called with the finalized settlement terms. Monica Sloan had accepted the 2-year spousal support arrangement, withdrew all claims on the property and the business, and requested only that certain personal items be made available for Carla to collect. It was a clean resolution, cleaner than I'd expected, honestly. I think the combination of the property deed, the financial documentation, and Grant Hollister's very public professional collapse had significantly narrowed Carla's leverage, and Monica Sloan was too experienced to keep pressing a position that had no ground under it. It's done, Paul said simply. Good, I said. And I meant it. Not triumphantly, but genuinely. Done was what I needed it to be. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, I hired 2 new crew chiefs and opened a 4th service district covering northern Mecklenburg County. The expansion had been in my business plan for 2 years. I'd been hesitant to move on it while the personal situation was consuming bandwidth. Once the situation resolved, the hesitation went with it. Rick Stokes threw a small thing at the shop. Nothing formal, just a few of the senior employees, some decent food from the barbecue place on Central Avenue, cold drinks in the parking lot on a Friday afternoon. He gave a toast that was characteristically brief. Here's to Wade Reeves, who kept every one of your paychecks coming through the worst few months of his life without complaining once. Drink up. Nobody argued with that. Cody spent alternate weeks with me and Carla under the arrangement we'd settled on. Not through attorneys, just a practical agreement between 2 people who both understood that their son's stability mattered more than their own convenience. It worked better than I'd expected. Cody had a steadiness to him that I recognized and tried to honor by keeping things predictable on my end. New routine, Same father. Lloyd came over one Saturday morning in February. Same thermos, same 2 mugs. We sat on the porch in the cold, and he asked how things were shaping up. Better, I said. And it was a true answer, not a polite one. Grant Hollister got quietly picked up by a smaller hotel group in Raleigh, Lloyd said. Heard it through someone at the chamber. Lower title, considerably lower salary. I thought about that. He'll land somewhere, I said. Men like that usually do. Usually, Lloyd agreed. Just not where they started. Curtis Payne had been terminated by the hotel group as part of the board's internal review. His role in the expense scheme had been documented and formalized in the investigation, and the group had opted for separation over litigation to keep the exposure contained. He'd retained an attorney and was apparently disputing the termination. Last I heard, it wasn't going well for him. Carla had moved to an apartment in South Charlotte. She and I had spoken twice since the settlement. Practical conversations about Cody's schedule, nothing more. There was no bitterness between us, which surprised me a little. What there was distance. The particular kind that grows between two people once the pretense that held them together finally gives way. I didn't wish her harm. I didn't wish her much of anything. That was its own kind of closure. Dennis came down in March, and we drove out to the coast for a long weekend. Wilmington, the beach in the off-season, cold water, and no crowds. We walked along the shore for a couple of hours one morning, saying almost nothing, the way brothers who know each other well can do. On the drive back, he said, "You seem like yourself again." "I am myself," I said. "More than you were," he said. "You've been losing yourself to that marriage for longer than you knew." I thought about that for a long time after. He wasn't wrong. There's a version of commitment that tips into self-erasure if you're not careful, where keeping the peace becomes more important than keeping yourself intact. I've been somewhere in that territory for years without recognizing it. The unraveling of everything had been genuinely painful. What had come out the other side of it was something I hadn't expected to find: clarity. Room to be the specific person I actually was rather than the person a failing marriage had gradually required me to be. One evening in April, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the neighborhood go through its spring routines. Kids on bikes, dogs being walked, a couple 2 houses down planting something in their front bed. Ordinary. Fully ordinary. And I thought about what Lloyd had said months ago. Do it because it's correct. I had. From the first conversation with Dennis to the last document Paul had placed in front of me, every step had been deliberate, grounded, and honest. I hadn't burned anything down for the pleasure of watching it burn. I'd protected what was mine, held people accountable for what they'd actually done, and kept myself functioning through all of it. Reeves Commercial Services went into its 17th year with a full client roster, a solid crew, and a 4th district that was already running profitable. My name was on the trucks, on the contracts, on the building. I'd built it, and I'd kept it, and nobody had taken it from me. That was the foundation. Everything else I'd figure out from there.